What's up, everybody? It's your guy, Ike Jones. We are back in the saddle talking a little bit more season preview 2024 right here. And today we're talking the Georgia Bulldogs. Last year, not able to come away with a berth in the playoff, but widely regarded as the best team going into this season. I don't know if anybody thinks otherwise. Today, here to talk about it because you know your guy Ike Jones. I don't know all things Georgia Bulldogs. I know a little bit, but we got Brooks Austin, lead editor for Dogs Daily, in here. Brooks, how's it going today?
Man, I'm hanging out. We are getting close. We're
Yeah,
like what I think 9 days from like week 0. We're
right.
16 days from the start of college football for the rest of us folks. Man, like we are here. It is. I call it the oasis of the off season. We have walked
Hmm.
through that sucker,
Yeah.
and we are on the backside. It is time to bear some fruit with regards to football.
Yeah, it's almost here, and it's time to start really just kind of looking at what's happening. We're talking Georgia football today, and for the people who don't know, right? Like Georgia, they've had some offseason stuff where some guys have been whatever, right? We don't want to talk any controversy, but what I do want to talk about is the hope that Georgia fans have that the dynasty continues there at Georgia, and they're going to get back into the place where they can compete for a national championship this season. And let's start that conversation by talking about the offensive side of the football. You've got a guy who really is going to be a Heisman contender, if we're being honest, at quarterback, and you've got
Mhm.
some pieces there offensively, but who are going to be the guys that he's trying to distribute the football to, right? Because the pass catching core, little in flux this season for Georgia. So talk to us a little bit about how Georgia is going to be able to manipulate offenses this season.
Yeah, I think 3 of their top 4 passers from last year will not be on the roster this year, right? You look at our pass catchers, I should say. You look
Right.
at Brock Bowers, Lad McConkey, and of course, as of late, Ra Thomas. Those 3 individuals no longer on the roster. So when it comes to receivers and guys that are going to take targets this year, you're looking at names like Dylan Bell, Dominic Lovett, Colby Young's now going to have to step up. The tight end Oscar Delp. Those are receiving options offensively that they're going to have to depend upon early in this season. You know, returning guys like Arian Smith, who have been around for a long time and certainly have been talented, but kind of have had ups and downs, whether it be with performance on field or being able to be on field at all with
Right.
regards to injuries and things like that. So they're new faces, but kind of old faces, right? Guys that have been around the program for a while, but are going to be dependent upon at a much higher rate this season. But I think the biggest addition off season wise to this roster has obviously been Trevor Etienne, and
Right.
SEC fans certainly are aware of him. He went from a guy that was kind of in a secondary role at Florida, and he's going to be in certainly a primary role for the University of Georgia this year. And I think he's going to provide a life in that room that, you know, is kind of relatively new to Georgia. The last couple of years, they've been leaning on guys like Kendall Milton and Dejon Edwards and Kenny McIntosh. I think Trevor Etienne returns them to, or at least gives them a new option to more of an explosive type of back that they
Right.
haven't really seen since probably, DeAndre Swift.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second, right? So you mentioned two names that I definitely want to get into before I switch over to talking about the running back situation. But Carson Beck,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have the cheat code at tight end this year, right? Is
Yeah.
he going to be able to reproduce, toss into a guy like Delp? And is Dominic Lovett ready to be the guy, right? He made the transfer over a couple of years ago. And when he was at Missouri, he was kind of the guy, right? Like, but he
Mm-hmm.
knew time was coming where it wasn't going to be him, right?
Yeah.
Like he had that number one that was sitting right over his shoulder that has proven to be everything that they hoped that he was going to be there at wide receiver. Dominic Lovett made the transfer over. Is he ready to transition to be the primary guy for this Georgia team at wide receiver this year?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know if he has to be the primary like winner. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't have to be a primary X receiver or even a Z receiver. I think he's going to find a role as a slot receiver, and he might be their primary target getter. Like he might lead the team in receptions, but I don't foresee like a 900,000 yard receiver or a season maybe from Dom as I might see from a guy like Dylan Bell. Who
Hmm.
I think might be much more of an explosive type of weapon for them this year. But in terms of a safety net and a guy that they know that they can depend upon. Dom Lovett's certainly going to be that this year for them. Like I said, I think my prediction for this season, receiver wise for them, is Dom Lovett leads the team in receptions, but Dylan Bell leads the team in yards. I think
Gotcha.
you look at an outcome like that for Georgia offensively this year. You talked about a guy like Oscar Delp, man, and this being an Auburn related podcast, I think Auburn fans will relate to this. There was a play in that football game last year where Oscar Delp is streaking down the middle of the field, and he looks like he's about to go for a 65-yard touchdown. The ball's just inside of him. They don't quite come up with the reception. I think 2 plays later, Carson Beck actually throws an interception on third down. Those types of plays last year, there were 5 or 6 of those where Oscar Delp streaking down the field could be a massive explosive for this offense, and they just don't quite come up with it. I think if those balls go a different way, we're looking at a preseason conversation about Oscar Delp this year that's completely different, that has
Mm,
nothing really to do with him or solely to do with him, right? It's a connection issue last year between him and Carson. But if his stat line last year while Brock Bowers was banged up, he had 400 yards. If his
right.
stat line last year were slightly different, if it were 570, maybe 600 yards because several of those completions are had, it's a totally different discussion about Oscar Delp. Oscar
Yeah.
Delp is still the same talent. He's still the same guy
Yeah.
that can get open and get vertically down the field as he was last year, slightly better. Hopefully, the rapport is a little bit different this year
Okay.
between Carson and Oscar.
So, from an offensive standpoint, shifting over to the run game, do you feel as if this is going to be a return to a more running back focused offense? Are you going to see a lot of run, a lot of running back screen this year to try to get ETN involved in that offense a little bit more? Because they had spread it around a little bit more with Carson Beck last season. Unexpectedly for me, it being his
Yeah.
first full season as a starter, Carson Beck had full command of that offense. Do you feel like they're going to lean on that run game a little bit more this year?
I think they're gonna lean on the running back room to provide more explosivity than they have in years past.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I don't know if they're gonna run the ball more per game, or the splits will be any different. I think last year they were about as close to 50-50
Right.
as you could possibly be. And honestly, I think more of the SEC is kind of going back towards that, right? We're trying to be a lot more balanced in this conference across the board, Auburn included.
Right.
So I think Georgia remains a balanced football team. I lean more on explosivity because it's not just Trevor Etienne. I think Nate Frazier has an ability to be a real force out of the backfield in the passing game this year as a true freshman, even in this running back room. They're going to get Branson Robinson healthy, and he'll be back. And Roger Robinson, assumably, is going to be healthy at some point this season. Is dealing with a toe injury right now in camp. But those are more like bruising running backs. Those are more of the running backs that are more akin to Georgia as of late, like the Kendall Miltons of the world.
Right.
But when we're talking about rippers, we're talking about home run hitters. Trevor Etienne and I think Nate Frazier are going to be able to provide that this year at a higher capita than in years prior.
Okay. All right. Well, we will see what happens offensively with Georgia this year. We're in here talking with our guy, Brooks Austin from Dogs Daily. Let's flip it over to the other side of the football. And this has been the calling card.
Yeah.
Listen, Kirby Smart is going to have a good defense. If you can count on anything, you can count on the sun rising and Kirby Smart having a good defense. Who are going to be the guys that are going to step up? We know about some of the guys in the defensive backfield that have been there for a couple of years, right? That are everybody knows about. But who are some of the guys on that defense that you're looking at and you're saying this guy needs to step up this year because we lost a little bit here, so we're going to have to get some step up from this guy,
Yeah, I think most people in the SEC remember Jamon Dumas Johnson having transferred this offseason to Kentucky.
right?
And in the news headline is that's a starter in the SEC, a preseason All American, I believe, in 2023. Didn't quite play up to those standards that fall. A starter in the SEC going from Georgia to Kentucky kind of like set off some, hey, that's interesting, right? Well, the reason being is because CJ Allen is on the path to potentially be the next guy at the inside
Mm,
linebacker position for Georgia. And they've had some great ones, right? They had that three-headed monster in 2021 of Channing Tindall, Quay Walker, and Nakobe Dean, all those guys now playing on Sundays.
right.
I think CJ Allen's got a chance to be as good as those guys and potentially
Mm,
even more statistically superior to those individuals. We talked about this on the show last night. You have to go back to 2019 since a Georgia linebacker has had more than 80 total tackles. CJ Allen had 48 last year as a true freshman. I think
mm.
this year he's going to have north of 80 tackles. I don't think he's going
Interesting.
to come off the field. I think he's going to be a national name at the inside linebacker position that people can align with Georgia defense for the first time since Nakobe Dean, really.
Mm. Oh, okay. We'll definitely have to keep an eye out for CJ Allen there on the interior of that defense. What about the defensive line, though? Right, like
Mm,
um, Georgia has been a team over the last few years. I think the only and critique is really a tough word to say when the defense is so dominant like Georgia. The only big thing that stood out to me from this Georgia team was they really weren't getting after the passer and getting a lot of sacks. Now they're
mhm.
getting good pressure, right? Because of the way that they design and the way that they can cover. But is
Yeah.
there a guy that's really just a disruptive pass rusher that's going to be on this defensive front for them?
Yeah, so it starts with Michael Williams, and he was playing a lot of defensive end the last several years. And man, when the number one overall draft pick in the NFL draft, Trayvon Walker, only produces 4.5 sacks at defensive end, I'm gonna tell you, it's pretty hard to do at Georgia. They have not had a 7, 8, 9.5 sack guy at that particular position ever. Really, the guys that get home the most in this defense historically have been that jack position, that stand up outside linebacker position. And you can even take this and apply this to Nick Saban's years at Alabama when Will Turner or Will Anderson moved
Will
from
Anderson.
defensive end to jack, right? He became a much more forceful player. Same thing for Dallas Turner, the same transition. The same transition is happening this year for Michael Williams. He's going from
Mm,
that defensive end position, and they're making a much larger package for him as a stand-up rusher. And he got to play a little bit of that in Florida State's football game. And if you turn the tape onto that game, he is disruptive to a T in that ball game. And they're going to play more and more of him at that role. And that's going to open up an opportunity for a guy like Tyrion Ingram Dawkins to get some opportunity at that defensive end role and become a slightly more disruptive player as he, ages on into this roster. But in terms of an interior defensive tackle position, that's where Georgia has, like, in their 2021 and 2022 seasons, that's where all that immediate pressure came from. And that's
right.
where all that immediate havoc came from. I don't know if they have a superstar at the defensive tackle position right now.
Hmm.
And not even just like available to them in an upperclassman role. We don't know if any of those younger guys are going to develop into a Jordan or a Jalen Carter or a Jordan Davis or a Devontae Wyatt even. We don't have those answers yet. What
Hmm.
I will tell you is they're still serviceable. Like
Right.
Nazir Stackhouse is still a fourth or fifth round draft pick after this season, no matter what he does. I believe he's an NFL guy, but he's not a first round draft pick. And there is a difference in
Right.
disruptivity between those two things. And I think everyone's kind of having this downfall, if you will. I look across the college football landscape right now. Find me the first round draft pick at the interior defensive line position. You're going to settle for Mason Graham at Michigan, and then you're really going to scratch your head and hope Walter Nolan performs like you think he can. And then after that, you're like, I don't know. Where is the defensive tackle production right now in college football? There's not a lot of game breakers at the spot.
Hmm. Well, I mean, having that in mind and looking at the experience that exists in that third level of the defense for Georgia, is that going to pose any issues because you're maybe not able to be as disruptive up front? Now, you've got a lot of experience back there, but are those guys going to be counted on a little bit more in that back end? And who are the guys, particularly on the outside, right? I know the safety position is solid, but particularly on the outside, that are going to have to step up for Georgia and be a little maybe more sticky this season than they've had to be in the past covering receivers.
Yeah, Dalen Everett is the returning starter at the cornerback position, right? And he's the only returning starter at the other positions you're talking about outside of safety, right?
Right.
Dan Jackson and Malachi Starks return as starters, but they're having to replace everybody else. They're having to replace Javon Bullard. They're having to replace Tyke Smith. They're having to replace Kamari Lassiter. And Dalen Everett returns from last year, and he'll be a solid, a starter at the cornerback position. I think Auburn fans will remember he knocked a pretty important pass down on, I think, 3rd and like 15 last year. Y'all try to back shoulder fade him on Georgia's sideline. He made an incredible breakup. But
Yeah, that
outside
was
of
that was a
that,
really good play.
man, he was kind of picked on last year because it was either, hey, we're not going to throw at Kamari. We're not going to throw at Javon Bullard. We're not going to throw at Tyke Smith. We're probably not going to throw at Malachi Starks. So we're going to have to throw at Dalen. So Dalen took his lumps last year. He's going to come back as a solid, SEC starter and a high-end starter at that position this year. Outside of that, man, they're battling, right? Jonel Aguero is the presumed starter at that nickel spot for them. And he's a really, really talented, explosive athlete, but he's still really fresh to that position, really new to that position. And he's going to get his first opportunity to kind of get attacked this year. And guess what? He's going to start the season with Clemson. And Antonio Williams, say what you want about Clemson's weapons. Antonio Williams is a really good slot receiver. They'll find out about Jonel Aguero really
Mm.
early in the year. The other corner spot's still a battle and it's still undetermined, but it's a bunch of really talented football players. It's Daniel Harris, a six, almost three, 200-pound corner that's, sub 4.4 in the 40. Extremely talented athlete. Gonna have to really learn how to tackle and play with an edge to play for Kirby Smart, though. You look at Julian Humphrey, same kind of story, an extremely talented athlete, top 100 player coming out of high school out of the state of Texas. And everyone knows about Ellis Robinson, the number one player in America, coming out of IMG Academy. He's battling for some reps as well. It's really first world problems that they're struggling with at Georgia.
Right.
It's, hey, which one of these future NFL players are we going to start at corner and allow to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I don't think anybody's worried about the Georgia defense, but I do wonder whether or not they're going to be as dominant, especially early. But let's pivot
Yeah.
over here and talk about that schedule early. In here, once again, talking with our guy, Austin Brooks from the Dogs Daily. And we're going to talk Georgia's schedule. 13-1 last year, that
Mhm.
one being a crazy SEC championship game. But then follow that up with the absolute destruction of Florida State in the bowl game. Vegas odds have the over under for Georgia this year at 10.5.
Mhm.
So they have to get to 11 wins, which is feasible, but this is actually a pretty tough schedule for Georgia. We'll look at this first block here, and we've got week 1 through 3. You started off with Clemson, neutral site
Mhm.
game. I guess you can call it neutral site. It's still there within the state of Georgia, but it's not a home game there. They play Tennessee's Tech. Nobody's worried about that game. You should absolutely destroy them. But then you go on the road to Kentucky, who is going to have a formidable defense this year. I don't know
Mhm.
how many people are very high on the Kentucky Wildcats, but I don't expect that. I expect that to be a slugfest right there
Yeah.
between two really tough defenses. How are you feeling going into the bye week? Clemson, Tennessee Tech, Kentucky, for how Georgia stacks up in that first block of the season.
We kind of laid out the map out of how I see the Clemson game going out last night on our show. I Offensively, man, their front five is so not Clemson standard, and it hasn't
Mm,
really been. People have really thrown shots at Cade Klubnik, and they even threw shots at DJU prior to Klubnik taking over there. But if you really watch Clemson football, it's immediate pressure on almost every down for those
yeah, the
quarterbacks,
defense has
and
saved that team for the last.
the defense has saved that team. And when I still think Georgia has a slight advantage offensively, even in that football game, despite the fact that Clemson is Clemson's standard. But I don't think Clemson's game plan defensively is ideal for that matchup for Georgia. Clemson, based off what they were doing, and I know it's a spring game, but the spring game's their identity. They're just going to add sprinkling onto that
Right.
identity with it, whatever comes game one. Their identity, apparently, according to what they put out on film the last end of last season and spring game, is they're going to be a high pressure rate team. They're going to be a team that sends five, and they're going to put corners and defensive backs and safeties on an
On
island.
islands.
That's not ideal for Georgia. Georgia gave up 11 sacks all year last year, and they returned 4 or 5 starters on the offensive line. And they have a quarterback, by the way, who ain't really susceptible to getting blitzed or giving up free hitters. Like that,
That
part of the
that's
reason they didn't give up
probably the
sacks
most
last year,
impressive thing for me with Carson Beck last year was he just in the face of
processor,
blitzes.
man.
Yeah, yeah,
Just a brilliant football mind. And I don't mean to toot my own horn, but if you knew anything about Carson, that's what you knew he was going to be good at. The dude is going to be able to see the game of football. Like he
yeah.
just brilliant, like a real football mind. The playing with confidence and the playing with arrogance that quarterbacks have to have in that quarterback aura. Those are the areas of growth Carson needs to have. But from a
Right.
being able to see it and throwing the ball accurately and making good decisions, that dude came out the box like that. It was
Yeah.
it was incredible, to be honest with you. But nah, man, I don't even know where we were with the discussion, but it's certainly an
Just talking
intriguing
about the
year.
first block of that season there, Clemson,
Oh, yeah,
Tennessee
yeah. The
Tech,
first block
Kentucky.
of the
Yeah.
mosquito. No, the Clemson matchup is not ideal for Clemson on either side of the football. And you talk about Kentucky. That always is a slobber knocker. There's something about Mark Stoops and his ability to make that Georgia game shrink possessions, make that Georgia game a 21-14 affair. But I look at Kentucky this year as somebody's got to be 7-5. I look at the entire SEC and I look at a bunch of football teams. There's like 6 or 7 of them that I could realistically look at and be like, you know what? I could squeak out a 10-win season for you if things just
Yeah.
break the right way.
Yeah.
I cannot physically, for the life of me, do that with Kentucky this year.
Mm.
Next year, I might be able to, but year one with Brock Vandagriff as a starter, I think it's going to be 2,800 yards passing. I think it's going to be 600 yards rushing, but I think it's going to be littered with a plethora of turnovers. And who would
Mm.
know how to create those more than Georgia in that football game?
That's the interesting thing about that matchup with Kentucky and Georgia, right? You got a guy who basically has been running your scout team the last couple of years in Brock Vandergriff, so you know kind of a little bit about tendencies from him. He's been there for a couple of seasons, and you have that transfer, middle linebacker that. If anything, you know the weaknesses of him. Kirby Smart knows how to exploit that. So I think it's going to be really interesting watching that matchup and whether or not Vandergriff is able to go out there and play maybe with a little bit of a chip and find his way, or Kirby's like, yeah, this is the reason why you weren't a starter because we know exactly how to exploit all the things that you don't do well. So I think that's a very interesting matchup to go out of and then get into your bye week there. You feeling like they go unscathed in those first three?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Side note, I was stunned that Auburn didn't take a stab at Brock Vandagriff.
Uh,
I think he is Malik Willis, by the way. I think that's
really?
what he is. Yeah. I
Okay.
think he's a first read. If it's open, he'll rip it with the best of them in the world. If not, he needs to create. I think
Mm,
that's what Brock Vandagriff is.
yeah.
And he's great when he's creating. He's great when the first read is wide open. What he's not great with is, all right, we got to go to two. Two's covered. Here goes the three. Three's covered. Check the ball down. That's
Mm,
just not his forte. Neither was it Malik's.
right.
Neither is it Gus's offense, by the way. I think Gus's offense, or not Gus, excuse me, Hugh Freeze's offense, I don't think needs to be two, three,
Yeah.
four reads. I think it needs to be one read open. No, let's create and be a playmaker now. That's what Brock
Yeah.
is. I was stunned.
I mean, it definitely. I think a lot of Auburn fans thought that was the direction it was going to happen, but hey, we are where we are.
He's got
Uh,
a plan. I
yeah,
know
no,
we're
one
doing
hundred
schedule
percent.
talk for Georgia. I am bullish as can be on Hugh Freeze. The dude recruits like nobody's business, and he very clearly has a plan. And he
Yeah,
has not deterred from his plan, not once.
yeah,
And that normally leads to success.
yeah. Listen, if especially if the plan is good, it leads to success. So far, so
Yeah,
good though.
yeah,
The recruiting is happening. We'll see what the results are offensively this year to see whether or not you can stack those recruiting classes and then get to a place where you can turn the corner as far as that offense is concerned.
yeah.
Coming off of the bye week, this is for me the most brutal stretch for Georgia between bye
Mhm.
weeks. You've got at Alabama, Auburn coming to town, Mississippi State. Don't really know what you're going to have there. Jeff Levy going to Texas before you get another bye week.
Mhm.
That's a rough stretch. Um, how are you feeling about those next 4 weeks in terms of what does Georgia need to do to survive those 4 weeks there?
So I'm going to give him the two games in between. I know I was just telling y'all how bullish I am on Hugh, and he's got a plan and all that stuff. But Auburn on the road in Athens, historically, not great.
Not been good.
So
Agreed.
not been good at
Yeah.
all. So I'm gonna go ahead and give him that one. Let's talk about Alabama and Texas. I'm very curious to see what Alabama looks like early in this football season, and I don't think they get tested prior to that Georgia game to a major extent.
Right.
But everyone's talking about the transition of Kalen DeBoer coming over to this conference, and I know the offensive mind that he is going to be successful in this conference because it is very akin to what Sark does, and it's a little bit of combination of the stacked reads that Heupel does. So it's like a hybrid of the two offenses. It's going to be successful. I don't have any doubts about that. My question is, you look at his historic choices at the quarterback position, they look nothing like Jalen Milroe. Michael
Nothing.
Penix, the way he plays looks nothing like Jalen Milroe. He took Will Rogers out of the portal. Those guys are the antithesis of one another. I mean,
Right.
my God, Will Rogers and Jalen Milroe play
Couldn't
two.
be
They might as well
further.
play two different sports.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they're not the same player. So he's never really had a quarterback like this. And I'm curious to see. I know he's smart enough to develop and change his offensive ideals to maximize the talents that Milroe are. I just don't know. Like it took Tommy Reese 7, 8 weeks, 9 weeks last year to figure out what he was going to do with Milroe.
Right.
Okay. And he had an extensive amount of time prior to getting that season started to actually figure it out. So I'm curious. I'm very high on what DeBoer is as a football coach. I mean, for Christ's sakes, he boxed Steve Sarkisian and he boxed Dan Lanning twice with far inferior football players on his roster. Okay, so he is a good football coach. I just don't
Right.
know what it looks like year one because there's a lot of transition and turnover. However, he does get that game on the road. I like Georgia's chances to win one out of those two games between Alabama and Texas, and I'm gonna pick it to be Alabama and not Texas, if that makes
That's
sense.
fair. I mean, I think it's difficult to go on the road to play Texas anyway.
Yeah.
And Sark, at that point in time in the season, to your point about the difference between that Bama game and that Texas game, a lot more film available to Sark at that point in time to figure out how he wants to attack. And Sarkeesian with time to prep is nah, nobody wants to see that ever.
No.
So,
No.
yeah, definitely going to be an interesting stretch there. Let's tune in a little bit just because of who we're talking about here on that Auburn game. You've already
Yeah.
talked about you think that Georgia gets that win, but last year is the big difference in this game just the venue, right? Because last
No.
year
No.
Carson Beck,
I Go
stepping into
ahead.
Jordan Hare, he played well, but
You did.
there's some differences here in this game. Is the bigger difference just hey, it's on the road, so Auburn doesn't have the opportunity to win that game, or how do you see that playing out?
I mean, historically, I threw that in, and I do think Georgia wins the game. I don't know if they handled them like they have historically, and here's why. That damn Hugh Freeze, he's a game plan wizard. Like
Yeah,
people gave a bunch of credit for the home field voodoo and the Jordan Hare stuff, and they did the thing that people do with Auburn when Auburn makes a game close that they have no business making close in that stadium. They all blame it on the stadium, but I'm
right.
gonna blame it on the fact that Hugh Freeze had the best run game design of any football coach that Georgia played last year. If you can, I know Peyton Thorne's sneaky fast. I know Peyton Thorne is
Ye-
faster than you expect him to be. I know Peyton Thorne is quicker than fast.
That
But
was
that some
absolutely a
bitch,
design.
bro, that dude has 60, he has 68-yard run backed up in his own end and
Yeah,
didn't get touched until he was past the 50-yard line. And
yeah,
that had nothing to do with Peyton Thorne. Shout out to Peyton Thorne.
yeah,
Congratulations. You're a good football player. That had everything to do with Hugh Freeze.
yeah.
Those dudes were in 13 personnel, okay, into the boundary. All right, out of nowhere. I don't know. I don't know a lot about Auburn football, but it was out of
No,
nowhere. And
they'd only
we're gonna
run that with
quarterback
Robbie Ashford
design
at
run
quarterback.
Peyton Thorne.
Yeah,
So they can do that, and he can make games competitive because Hugh Freeze is a really, really good offensive game designer. I 100% believe that. So I do believe Georgia wins the football game. When I have to pick that one, I will talk about that all week about, hey, Auburn A is a better football team than they were last year. B, this Hugh Freeze guys does good things in these big games. He is the opposite of Lane Kiffin. Like Lane Kiffin, everyone picks against in big games. Hugh Freeze, the moment he gets talent, people will recall, hey, he's been fighting these giants with David's slingshot for most of these times, and
right.
now he's stacked top 10 classes. That's what it's going to be in a couple years. It's just not there yet.
Okay. All right. I like it. I am, and to your point, he is kind of the anti. I don't want to pick
He
on Lane
is.
Kiffin. I,
He's
I,
bro.
I,
He's a
I
he's
get,
a
I get
big
on
game
Lane Kiffin
football
too
coach.
much.
He is
Yeah.
a big game football coach. That is what Hugh Freeze's history tells me he is.
Okay. But that's it, man. That's all we really wanted to talk about today. I appreciate you giving us a little bit of the time. If people don't know how they can keep up with what you're doing over there at Dogs Daily, tell the people what you got going on there, Brooks.
Yeah, you can check me out on all social medias at Brooks Austin BA. Obviously, Dogs Daily, the Georgia stuff. But we also do a bunch of college football content on YouTube at the Film Guy Network. We talk all things college football 4 hours a week, Monday through Thursday. So come check us out for real. We do a good job, I believe. So appreciate you guys for having me for real.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you very much. All right, we're going to get out of here. We got so much more content to get to you guys, but you can follow us. We are at The War Report on social media. I am TWR Ike Jones on all the places that you need to follow me. Make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back at you with more SEC content